Good afternoon, everyone. It's been quite the day, hasn't it? It's just been amazing to hear these inspiring conversations, and I have to say, this is like day 8 for me on the job, and all day I've been feeling like, damn, I got a good job. So I'm looking forward to this next conversation, but I do want to say a little bit about what we've been hearing in terms of the inspiring stories we heard this morning. I was quite struck with the idea that bank as a 4-letter word maybe isn't quite at love, but actually could be moving in that direction. Whoops. Okay, there we go. And we heard about work that's happening with Black Girls Code, that amazing video showing us what's happening with African American youth in Oakland, how we have the opportunity to begin to deal with the question of racial segregation in the restaurant industry. How game changers are thinking in completely different ways, thinking about apps to help us to be engaged in this process in new ways to help in that effort around segregation in restaurants. How we are shifting paradigms, we are unleashing opportunity, we are taking on this challenge of our time, the challenge of advancing equity. So we've heard these different views, we've heard all of this exciting work that's underway, and now we're going to bring together this amazing panel to talk about our collective work together, to talk about the opportunity to craft a collective agenda around regional equity. And just as we have heard all day, this panel too has some amazing and dynamic leaders. So I don't want to take any more time away from the discussion we're going to have, but I do want to let you know that we are going to end with enough time for some questions so we can engage a little bit with all of you in conversation before we close. So let me start now with some introductions of this amazing panel. And the first person I want to introduce is Ratna Amin. And Ratna comes to us as the Director of Transportation Policy at SPUR, where she works on seamless transit issues, and she has a long history on these issues and a lot to tell us about transportation and land use and transit and the integration of these in the context of creating a more equitable Bay Area. And next we have Gloria Bruce, and Gloria is the Executive Director of East Bay Housing Organization. And the East Bay Housing Organization is a leading advocacy coalition working in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. And I also want to say that Gloria was a multicultural fellow with the San Francisco Foundation, something that we're very proud of, and having worked with several fellows and having a new CEO who was a fellow, quite an amazing group of people. Next, we have Matt Haney. Now, Matt has many different hats, and he promises to tell us as he's speaking which hat he has on. So he is both with the San Francisco Unified School District. He's the Director of Policy at Dream Corps and Green for All, works with Yes We Code, and is a co-founder of Cut 50. And we have Jonathan Logan. Jonathan is the Director of the Marin City Community Services District, and he's been involved in many different community initiatives that are centered on making Marin City a place that is good for all of its residents, focused on youth development, community development, planning, community policy, economic development. A lot to say around Marin City. And then finally, we have Derica Mearns, who's the Executive Director of Working Partnerships USA. I've had the pleasure of working with Derica quite a bit over time, and I can guarantee she will have a lot to add to this conversation that we're going to have today. So let me come and sit with you all. And let me just start by giving you all an opportunity to spend a couple minutes to help the audience here to get a sense of how you're connected to advancing a more equitable Bay Area. Ratna, you want to start us off?
Thank you, Judith, and thank you so much for having SPUR be a part of this conversation. Again, I'm the Transportation Policy Director at SPUR. SPUR is a nonprofit that promotes good planning and good government. We have offices in the 3 largest cities in the Bay Area, San Francisco, San Jose, which we opened about 3 years ago, and Oakland. And growing from San Francisco to 2 more cities has made us regional in an exponential way, because each of those cities is part of an ecosystem and a sub-region, and then it adds up to our larger region. I think one of the things we want to talk about today is collaborating across the region, and just two ways we see that happening a lot at SPUR. One is across disciplines. Because we work across issue areas, housing, transportation, food access, sustainable development, public realm, and urban design, we can collaborate across these disciplines. And that's been, to us, extremely educational and helps us become better, offer better technical assistance in the places we work and at the regional policy level. And because we work across this geography, we are now kind of a glue or a messenger across these spaces between cities, city governments, transportation agencies, utilities, all the actors in these geographies, and connecting the dots across the region. So I look forward to talking more about these things today.
Gloria?
Thanks, Judith, and I'm really pleased to be here as well, and it's just so exciting I love being in rooms talking to my other friends who geek out on housing and land use, but it's really just so much better to follow up on Dr. Burke Harris's amazing talk, or talk about the arts, or see Ghost Town to Havana, which left me crying. I mean, because we're all talking about the same thing in our communities, and that gap of opportunity. And the way our organization, East Bay Housing Organization, approaches it is through our network of members. We're a 31-year-old organization with almost 500 organizations and individuals in our membership, united by the mission of preserving and promoting and creating more affordable housing opportunities. So everything we do is collective. And a lot of our work is locally based, because we're often trying to get a city to pass more funding for affordable housing, or we're trying to convince neighbors that having an equitable, inclusive city is actually a good thing. It's what you should want. It benefits everyone. But we look for those local changes that are going to have regional examples or impact. And we look for those ideas that can build a regional movement, whether we're talking about Contra Costa County or Oakland or Alameda. Simple ideas like, it's time for the private sector to step up and help contribute to doing something about the impacts of this exponential growth in this area of abundance. Or simple ideas like, if you have public land, some of that public land should be dedicated to the public good. And one thing that we're working on, and we'll talk more about it later, but right now in the city of Concord and Contra Costa, there's a historic opportunity where a private developer will be given the chance to remake a former military facility, something that's going to be the size of a new small town. And that's very important to the people in that city, but it's important regionally as well. And so we really want to mobilize and take the lessons from that and bring it outward. So I'm really excited to talk more about that this afternoon.
Thank you. Well, my name is Matt Haney. I'm very excited and honored to be here. I can't quite see many of you with the bright lights, but I'm looking forward to hearing from you all and having this dialogue with the folks on the panel and everybody here. So I have a couple hats, as was mentioned. I serve as the Vice President of the Board of Education for San Francisco Unified School District. We are the main and only public school system here in San Francisco. We have close to 140 schools, 56,000 students, and as I said, we cover all of San Francisco. I think my work with regards to this conversation on the school board has been to think about the tremendous change that is happening in this city and how to make it work for our communities and for our kids. How can we make sure that the change that's coming here is actually change that our young people have access to and can benefit from? I think that all of us are fighting for, and certainly in our school district, a San Francisco in which no matter what school you go to, no matter what zip code you're in, you have the opportunity to fulfill your potential, and if you choose to, stay here, live here, and thrive here in San Francisco. And I think that that's going to take some big changes in how we ensure that our young people have access to what's happening in San Francisco. With Dream Corps, I'm the Director of Policy. We have 3 initiatives: Yes We Code, Cut 50, and Green for All. 21st century jobs, not jails. Close prison doors, open doors of opportunity is our slogan. And really, what I'd say there, and this is also how I would define equity, we need solutions that are as big and comprehensive as the challenges that we face. We don't need a couple people out of prison. We need half the people out of prison in the next 10 years and then even go further than that. We don't need a couple people exposed to coding. We need huge numbers of our young people having access to that industry. So that's the way we think about it, and looking forward to this conversation.
Great.
Thank you. So I'm Jonathan Logan, and I'm the General Manager of the Marin City Community Services District. Marin City is an unincorporated area in Marin County, and the Community Services District is the local government there for that community. We're responsible for municipal services, street lighting, garbage pickup, parks and recreation, provide services to about 4,000 residents. But because of our unique position as the local governing agency there with the public voice, our district, we get involved in just about any public policy issue affecting Marin City residents. And so from that standpoint, we're involved in transportation, education, economic development, overall community development. Many of these activities we initiate as the district, and others we support as a major player with our community-based partners. I think my role here today is to provide a local voice to how regional planning potentially impacts the local community. You know, there are certainly opportunities to align what we do at the local level with what's going on regionally, and so I hope to provide that perspective today.
Great. And hello, everyone. Hello, Judith. I'm Derica Merns, and so I'm going to talk about 3 buckets and then kick it off to you. So I'm the Executive Director of Working Partnerships USA. We're a labor community nonprofit in Silicon Valley that's fought for a just economy in the Valley for 20 years this year. Whoop, whoop. As we approached 20 years, we also co-founded a new campaign that I'm really excited about called Silicon Valley Rising, which is about inspiring the tech industry that it is their job to engage with us on creating a middle class in this economy. And I think that's important for the Bay Area, as we heard earlier about the horrific numbers, low numbers of middle wage jobs that we are projecting. And then my third hat is really with the Great Communities Collaborative, which this foundation is, it's your initiative, and I really believe that the new strategic plan of the foundation, as well as with GCC, is going to inspire and infuse an equity focus that's going to put people at the center of how we build great communities in the next 10 years.
Fabulous. So one thing I've been struck by living here is how we live in a community. You live in San Francisco, you live in Oakland, but you also really identify with being from the Bay Area, right? Someone asks you, and you might say, oh, I'm from Oakland, but then just right after they say, oh, I'm from the Bay Area. And so we recognize ourselves as being in the Bay Area. And Gloria, I want to turn to you to talk about the work you've been engaged in with some of your colleagues here that really started in a brand new way, this idea of a collective regional Bay Area equity agenda. So tell us something about it.
Sure.
What's going in this conversation?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point, Judith. It's so interesting how we're both so local and so regional at the same time. And what are some of the things that are moving so that we can be more powerful together? I think Dr. Pastor was saying earlier, like, so many of our problems come from disconnection. So how can we get over that? And one of the things that you asked me to talk about, which several folks up here have been engaged in, is somewhat of a wonky way of getting at that connection, but a really important one, I think. So I'm just curious, raise your hand in the audience if you've ever heard of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission.
Ooh. Wow.
Okay, well,
wow.
I'm just going to say, see, I was wondering, because y'all are also the kind of folks who laugh at demography jokes. So you're a special group of people, because most people have not heard of MTC or the Association of Bay Area Governments. But there's this idea that there are actually these regional bodies that have the potential to knit together the work that we're all doing in our different counties and cities. And something kind of exciting that's happened over the past couple years is that the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, actually partnered through MTC, that in itself, a housing department and a transportation department, a federal one and a regional one coming together. That's pretty exciting for people like me in and of itself. But decided to give a $5 million grant to the Bay Area under something called the Sustainable Communities Initiative. And what was so exciting about that grant was not just the money, though it was important, but the fact that the whole process of dispersing that money was different, that community groups were involved in it, that there was an eye towards equity and organizing, and that those funds distributed through this regional body helped groups work on local projects and pilots that would have regional significance, and helped others work on regional research that would have local impact. And there was a housing work group and a jobs work group and an equity work group. And when you have these government bodies talking about equity and meaning it in the context that we mean it, I think that's pretty exciting and potential. And it's a little bit different than building a movement in the streets, but you got to have what's happening in the conference rooms and conference calls as well. And I know Derica did a lot of really interesting work under that strategy.
Mm-hmm. And I can talk about it. So we were part of the jobs group as well as the equity group. Here's the bottom line. We were able to, we had a question. If we were going to move low-wage workers in the Bay Area up, if you were going to make life better for Bay Area workers who are low-wage, how would you do it? What would be the approach to shared prosperity? So the first thing we needed to do was look at the numbers. And I think more than anything, the numbers that stuck with me and really inform how I think of our movement work over the next 10 years are the following. In the Bay Area region, there are 1.1 million workers who are low wage, 1.1 million. A third of the workforce in this region is low wage, making $18 an hour or less. Over the next 10 years, there are only about 30,000 middle wage job openings projected per year. About 300,000 middle wage jobs total over the next 10 years will be created. That includes replacement jobs with a large number of retirements. Let's think about what that means. That means that for 2/3 of low wage workers, even if they get a PhD, there's nothing for them at the end of the day. There's no job. There's no job. So it was a profound finding that was in the context of this economic prosperity strategy, where we were looking at research, but we were doing it in from an organizing approach. We were engaging folks all over the region through meetings and hearing from low-wage workers themselves, what do you need? And for us, it means that raising the floor for some portion of those 1.1 million jobs is critical. Minimum wage is no longer a communist socialist strategy, y'all. If we don't raise the floor, we're segregating workers forever into a caste system where they will never have opportunity. And raise the floor strategies are also not enough. The industries that are projected to grow jobs in the region are not middle wage right now. And we have got to figure out how we can create more middle wage jobs, not steal them from San Francisco to Santa Clara, right? We've got to actually create new middle wage jobs. That was, I think, one of the most people-focused findings that we sort of drove us to form Silicon Valley Rising, sort of saying, we've got to think really differently about how we are approaching jobs and figure out all the levers, not just in the public sector where we have billions of dollars that we need to trigger for good jobs, but we have to induce industry to be at the table with us to figure out what their role is, especially in their supply chain.
So, Matt, as you're thinking about how you have kids in the education system heading into this new economy, how do you think about getting them trained and ready for a region that you hope will have job growth, that they can actually get a job, have a living wage?
It's interesting because I think a lot of places around the Bay Area even, but certainly around the country, look at San Francisco and think, well, if we only had that, if we only had those companies, if we only had that type of industry and that type of innovation. And yet here in San Francisco, you could have a company, let's just choose one, Twitter, and you could have, literally in the shadow of that company, children who are growing up literally in terms of their experience in a way that couldn't be farther away from what is happening inside that building. Farther away in terms of exposure, skills, knowledge, access to the growth, the creativity that's happening in there. So I think that it's a unique challenge in some ways, but it's also a critical one, because as we see, and I know that this conversation is happening in Oakland now, where they're saying, oh my God, Oakland is becoming like San Francisco, Uber's moving in. How has San Francisco thought about this? And that geographic proximity to these kind of opportunities is not enough. It's not enough for it just to be there. There have to be intentional, concrete, strategic ways in which people are coming together, public and private sectors coming together, and we're actually figuring this out and building the pathways and the systems in order to do it. And I think in San Francisco, we've been able to do that with some partners strategically, where we've been able to create those opportunities. But I think we have a long way to go. I wish that I could say that we had the solution, that we could call up Oakland and say, this is how you do it. I think that's one of the reasons why this conversation regionally is so important, because the ways in which these new industries move around and the similar challenges that we face in our communities in terms of how to access them and how to build true pathways to be included in them are similar across the Bay Area. So I have a lot of hope that we'll figure it out, but I think that it's going to take everyone at the table building those partnerships strategically, intentionally, because the proximity, I can say, from San Francisco hasn't been enough for us.
So Ratna, you can talk about, right, the way the jobs are spread and how
exactly.
we need to connect better to those.
Yeah, I think one of the many interesting findings of the economic prosperity strategy that you all are discussing was that low-wage jobs, lower wage jobs in the region are spread everywhere. They are not in, and same for the workers, they're everywhere. And so in a denser community like San Francisco, you have more high-wage workers and more low-wage workers. Same in Vallejo, same in Livermore, same in Oakland. It might vary a little bit. So we can't assume these types of workers are actually as segregated as I think the notions have been in the past. But what that means for our region, when the jobs are so spread out, and it's an exceptionally big problem in the Bay Area, we are unlike any other region in how decentralized the jobs are. We've got to actually invest in a system that gets everybody around, not just one group of people. And it may be old-fashioned, but we think that actually a really great, affordable public transit system that most people will use is worth pursuing and is a win for equity, actually, even if it's everybody together in the system. But that entails a lot of difficult choices. At the local level, that's, do we put our stops close together so more people can access the system, or can we spread the stops out a little bit more and have faster service so the working class can get to work quickly and get home quickly? And there are trade-offs also at the regional level too. Are we going to focus on the core system and make it fast so people can get to opportunity? Because another finding was that those who make more money travel farther to their jobs. So if we want to give folks access to a better opportunity, they might have to travel further. Can we facilitate that through our transit system? And are we willing to make the hard choices that come with that?
Jonathan, talk about your perspective from Marin City, hearing this conversation about jobs and opportunities spread around the Bay Area.
Yeah, so I think, coming from Marin, a lot of folks probably wouldn't know that about 46% of all those that live in Marin are below the self-sufficiency standard in the county. And the way that's measured is it looks at housing costs in the county, and it compares that to the wage and household size. And so 45% of residents in the county aren't self-sufficient. And it means that they're spending much more on housing than they would in other scenarios. I think it's like 34% is the average, and we're closer to 50 for many residents. And so I think the issue of figuring out how do we create those middle wage jobs in a county like Marin is something that's going to be difficult. It's a slow growth county. A lot of the folks that live there, that work there, they travel distance, to get to work. So they're commuting into San Francisco and they're commuting into Oakland for work. And so what we have in Marin City or in Marin County are service level jobs. And so I think, this notion of how do we raise the floor is, would certainly be key for our community, increasing the minimum wage, and that's an opportunity there. I think the other thing that I would just mention is, making sure that the skills that are being taught at the community college level and through various vocational programs, that those skills align with the jobs that are available currently, and that's obviously easier said than done, but those are some of the challenges. One other point I'll just make there is, I don't think as a region we have a clear definition of what equity is, and probably across the country. Some people characterize it as equity of opportunity, while others say equity of outcomes, and it's probably somewhere in the middle where we want, everyone to have a fair shake as it relates to healthcare. We want everyone to have, decent housing, and then, we will leave it up to God and everyone else to figure out how much money you can make. So I think, that we have to define equity for this community, and that's why this discussion is so important, and San Francisco Foundation is leading it, is because it gives us an opportunity to tell the broader public, this is equity, this is what it means for the Bay Area, and this is how you can plug in to change things. Most people are good people, and they want to figure out how they can help, but they have to figure out how their investment will be targeted in a way that's going to actually move the needle.
Right?
Just as an approach, I think there's equity. Ultimately, this is about power, too, right? The approach that we have to take to regional equity is one that needs to build the kind of power to take on the rules that are gamed against us right now. And so, Ratna's point that it was sort of not a no-brainer that low-wage workers actually don't travel for their job as much as high-wage workers, because frankly, if you can get a shitty job down the street, why wouldn't you just get that one, right? So yeah, no-brainer in one sense, but it assumes that the service jobs that are the growth jobs in the region, there are, a number of high-wage jobs that are growing as well, but there's a bunch of low-wage jobs growing. It assumes that all of those jobs forever have to be low-wage. The tech industry contracts out a quarter of its service jobs and just decides not to pay great for them. They could tomorrow decide to insource a quarter of their jobs and make them good jobs. And that is a question of power. And so I think that one thing we have to remember is that as we have this conversation, leading with people and we have to remember that the approach we take is not about the policy as much as it is how we get at the policy and how we're building the structures to take on the rule-changing system, which is a democracy. So let's go out and elect people. Let's do what we need to do. But we got to keep that, I think, center in the equity discussion.
I totally agree. And it's you build that power through people, but also through changing the story about why things are the way they are, that, this isn't the way that it has to be. B, that this is not a matter of individual failure or individual choices, whether it's an individual choice to, take a crappy job because it's the only one available, or an individual moving into a gentrifying neighborhood. It's not about vilifying that individual. It's about, these are bigger market forces that are aligned, and we need to be telling a shared story about the fact that vilifying any one sector is not going to do us any good, but we could change these jobs tomorrow. We could provide more opportunity tomorrow. And let's also not forget why people are commuting so far to those jobs, because that's the only place that they can find someplace to live that's affordable. And you have to be looking at both of these pieces too. And Ratna mentioned earlier about kind of the old-fashioned solution, right, of having a good transit system, which communities in Europe figured out 100 years ago. I think I'm really glad that the San Francisco Foundation is supporting both the game-changing new ideas, but is also continuing to invest in the communities and people and organizations who have been working on these crisis issues for decades. Because folks, we all know this. The idea that we are in a housing crisis now that didn't exist 5 or 10 or 20 years ago is ridiculous. The idea that, there's growth in these low-wage jobs, with the fact that people haven't been left behind for decades. We all know that this is the case. And I think we need to be finding new ways forward for sure. But we also have people who know that there are no-brainer solutions to the fact that, for example, we have communities like Marin City and Alameda and Oakland, where African Americans moved into these communities 50 years ago to build up the economy and shaped the economy and helped this country win a war, and then are living in, their descendants are living in the same housing that was meant to be temporary and is just sitting there in these beautiful settings, but is not up to par or what it should be. And we have solutions to that. It's like, let's invest in housing. Let's put housing fees in place. Let's, have developers pay part of their fair share. Let's use those solutions that we know that they work, and then let's also be collaborating to find the new ones.
Go ahead.
I just want to add to that. Thank you, Gloria, for bringing up the need to keep investing in the solutions we actually kind of know work, but need more capacity or momentum or political acceptance. And I just want to talk about, you mentioned that I worked on something called seamless transit that has just captured the imagination of a lot of folks. And it was a look at how we have so many transit operators in the Bay Area. It depends on how you count, 28 and up. And we thought this was was a problem for the user and was very irritating, but the more you look at it, the more you realize this is a problem for workers, it's a problem for growth, it's a problem for urban design. There's just all these ways it manifests itself because we've generally chosen now to grow ourselves around transit. But the transit's a little shaky and it's confusing, and both from a planning perspective and a rider perspective. So while we're doing this research, we kind of found a dark corner of MTC. Which so many of you know about, and where they've been, I would say, toiling away on really difficult work of bringing the region's transit operators together. The Clipper card, it's a very hard one, expensive success, and now we need to do Clipper 2.0 and make it a lot better. And they kind of know what the work is that we need to do. They can play the role of convener, but we just need a lot more horsepower behind these efforts. But we know what the work plan is actually. And just imagine if a team like that within an agency had some of the horsepower of an Uber or a Lyft or some of the other organizations in our region.
So I want to pick up on a couple of themes I think that are underlying here, which gets to Derica's point about power, because we are in a pretty different moment now in terms of movement building, right? Black Lives Matter, the conversation about racial equity is really quite substantially different than it was a few years ago. And so I wonder if you all can think a little bit about the movement building possibility in the context of this conversation around housing and education and places that may be more distant but are still a part of the region, and transportation, and how we can think with a movement building frame in the context of needing to accelerate this work, right? To get to those outcomes faster because the economy is moving so much faster.
I think that's one of the opportunities when we think about a regional strategy. The politics in every community, it varies. The players in the community, those vary. And so, something like schools, it's hard to craft a regional strategy when you have an elected board in San Francisco and one in Oakland. We have quite a few in Marin County. And so it's difficult for those things, but in terms of movement building to create a legislative agenda that we could all support here in the Bay Area, and that we hand to our politicians and we say, in Sacramento, we want you to fight for full service community schools. We want you to fight for redevelopment to exist again, which, by the way, 20% of funds went to affordable housing, which is one of the issues that we're grappling with now. So I think, this idea of figuring out how our communities and the various advocates could have a network, share a network, where, regional solutions could be developed and then given to our legislature to move forward, I think would be a really powerful opportunity.
Matt, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think it goes without saying that this is a very, very strange time for politics. It's like nothing seems predictable, nothing seems like what's going to happen next. And I think that in a lot of ways it's scary for obvious reasons, but it's also potentially an opportunity for us to create something new. Obviously, what was happening before was not working, and got us to where we are now, where we weren't able to think ahead. We weren't able to think in a bold way. We weren't able to face the problems that are in front of us. So in this new environment, which I think also has its own set of challenges. I mean, one of the questions that we are going to have to face and are facing now is, what is our relationship with the role of government in all of this? I think in what's happening right now, a lot of how you might characterize it is that people have lost trust and lost faith in government's ability to solve big problems. So in that context, it also challenges us to think, okay, how do we, in that environment, start to think about other ways, other types of solutions, other arrangements that maybe can do a better job in its own way? I mean, the idea of us sort of creating a sort of a regional government that has a lot of faith and trust and all that in big government solutions is I think, right now, harder to get to in a lot of ways. So I think that what I'm excited about with all of this is this idea that we're beginning to become clear on what should be a baseline for every human being in our society, of dignity, of access to opportunity, and we're starting to have that conversation in a new way. And what I feel like that's allowing us to do is in line with what this conversation and this conference is. Okay, well, what does it actually take to get there? How do we get there? And let's not just focus on the old ways of how we might have thought about this, but let's actually put everything on the table and everyone at the table, because and I think that's what people want to hear, not that we're going to just do the small things in the old ways. And I think that's an opportunity that we have.
And I think we're starting to see that. Well, I say a lot with our organization, EBHO, that we used to have to spend a lot of time convincing people that housing mattered, affordable housing is important, hey, there's a crisis, it's actually in your neighborhood too, even if it's community opportunity. We don't have to have that conversation anymore. Where people are sold on that, and I was just talking to a colleague saying there is more attention to this issue than he ever remembered, and hasn't quite yet translated into the kind of fast action that we want to see, or that collective action yet. But I do think, as you're saying, Matt, that we're starting to see things break open that were third rails before. I mean, it's only a matter of time before you sit on a panel like this before someone mentions Prop 13, so I got to do it. Prop 13, people are actually starting to talk about like opening up Prop 13. People are starting to revive rent control. Thank you, Richmond. I mean, like, these are like, they still are seriously dirty words in a lot of quarters, but things are at a point where people are like, you know what? Like, let's just go for it. Let's try some of these old solutions. Let's try some of these new solutions. And it's an exciting time. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's exciting.
So let's hear from others about where you see that edge and where you see that people are actually moving to having those kinds of conversations we wouldn't have had. They were third rails, but now maybe not so much. Who wants to dive in? Derek?
Yeah, no, I'll dive in.
Okay.
So, I mean, the Prop 13 conversation, not to beat a dead horse, so for a decade, sets of players across the state set out to build power in communities of color, built an alliance called California Calls, started making doing coalition building with unions, and said, you know what, we're going to take on Prop 13, and it may be 10 years from now, it may be another 5 years, whatever it is, but we're going to eventually get there. And again, it was having the long view of doing our base building regional work and keeping that work in the context of the long game, right? And so I think that I observe that along with having done community organizing and work for 15 years, folks are just much less siloed. I mean, I think we all who are doing this movement work together get that, like, it's not about institution building anymore. It is about being ruthlessly opportunistic when we need to be about our alliances to move the needle. And we haven't, and this isn't what Matt is saying, but I want to make sure people aren't hearing this, we haven't given up on government yet, y'all. Like, it is the only equalizer. It is where, in my county, in Santa Clara County, $14 to $16 billion is spent every year by government. We need to go after that money. Uber does, Lyft does, every corporation. You know, we need to re-envision, we need a new approach to how we work with government. But we cannot give up on government being the glue of our common wealth. It is the way we collect resources together for a vision. And we need to own the rulemaking process within government, meaning the seats, so that we can change them.
So you are government.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, no, I was going to just say, you know, to build on that, I totally agree that government plays an important role. And what we have to do as governments, large and small, is figure out how do we get those voices in the room and a seat at the table to actually provide meaningful input. I'll give you just a quick example. About a year or two ago now, our district received a $5 million grant to build an outdoor community center with amphitheater and playground equipment for kids, barbecue grills, the whole nine. And the first thing that we did is we created a community advisory council made up of residents, stakeholders. And I mean, we initially wanted them just to tell us if they thought an amphitheater was a good idea or if, you know, if we thought barbecue grills were a good idea. But they took it and they ran with it. I mean, they were picking out the details of what color should the garbage can be and should we have 6 in this area or only 4. And since we opened the park, it's been used by the community you know, nonstop. And the neighbors actually love it. They don't complain about the kids making noise because they're doing positive things and living healthy lives. But what I learned from that was the power of engaging folks very early on in the process. And that's really what equity is about. You know, it's not just about outcomes. It's not just about opportunities to enroll in this program or to take advantage of this opportunity. It is about having a seat at the table and actually deciding how our goods are going to be distributed and how the burdens are going to be distributed. And I guarantee if you have those folks at the table, the conversation is going to look a lot different. And so the point I'm making is we as government, we do a decent job in some cases, pretty poor job in other cases of engaging the community. But to the extent that we can do it in a real way that really engages, gets the feedback, folks will start to trust and believe in government again, and we'll be more effective.
Hear, hear. It is about that wisdom, that voice, that experience that comes from residents and figuring out how to integrate them into that process. Ratna, is that happening in transportation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about how it's happening in Transportation California today. And we actually are having this really amazing moment around streets and roads, and it's a national movement, but it has so much to do with people having control over their community and being a safe and healthy place to live. And you know, after about 50 years of car-centric design, and we probably mostly all drive, I don't want to make any assumptions about anybody, but 90% of folks in the Bay Area need to drive to where they need to go because of the way we've built our region, because of the land use and how we've built it for the last 50 years, mostly after World War II. And you're starting to really see things take hold that were unimaginable 10 or 20 years ago around developing bike lanes for everybody that are safe. You know, Google's talking about it. How do we make bike lanes that are for 8-year-olds up to 80-year-olds? And it's actually trickling up into state policy. So local leaders and advocates are becoming part of state institutions. Many nonprofits and advocacy groups and legislators are also leading the fight. And I'm really seeing a major difference in the way we can talk about what's possible. You know, the window of what we consider normal is actually really starting to shift. And I think, again, the benefits will be widespread. When a street slows down, at least from our perspective, that's good for everybody, actually. You know, and it may not seem, these are fights still, changing how our streets work, but it's actually a small little revolution happening.
It's a perfect moment as we're starting to talk here about local leaders. Let's turn to some of you as local leaders, and see if you have any questions for the panelists or any comments that you'd like to make in this conversation we're having about a collective equity agenda for the region. Anyone have anything they'd like to add? There we go, right there. Terrific. There's a mic for you.
Hi, John. Well, I'm from Marin City also, but I'm gonna ask a question. I'm gonna exclude you on this question. Because you know our thinking. Has anybody else on the panel heard of community land trusts, where the community owns the land and they create housing in perpetuity, and it would add equity and a level of power to community people? And it's an underused asset. You know, so you might comment on that.
Gloria, you want to say something about that? And I expect
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up, community land trusts, and I think it falls within this general idea of community ownership, or ownership that isn't just about the market or profit motivated. And I think we need to be looking at many models of that as possible. It's basically the idea, as you said, sir, that essentially a community member or nonprofits own land, and they might, for example, lease the home on top of that land for 99 years to someone, and that means, but they only are charging that person for the cost of the home, not of the land underneath it, because land is the thing that's really expensive. And it's a way for that household to have a more affordable place to live in perpetuity. And when they move on, somebody else will move in and have that affordable place. And there are definitely, the Bay Area is one of the hot spots for those types of innovative solutions. There's land trusts, there's San Francisco Community Land Trust, there's one in Oakland, there's Northern California Land Trust, but it's a tiny, tiny part of the market right now, in part because an organization like that, even with support from foundations, trying to compete in this land market to get more community control is extremely, extremely difficult. I think whenever we have an organization that is actually able to own land and building and assets that's mission driven, I think that's incredibly important, and we need to encourage that as much as possible. But so far it's a small thing that's growing.
Okay, terrific. Other questions, comments? Okay, good. Thank
Yes, hello, my name is Carl Anthony. I'm with Breakthrough Communities. And I wanted to call attention to the issue of climate change. And I'm wanting to ask each of the panelists, or any of the panelists, to reflect on the fact that the whole world is really facing the fact of losing the base of support for life on the planet. And this is either a negative proposition where all the things that we're talking about are head to the dead end, or it is a positive opportunity to really begin to grapple with all of the systems on the planet as exemplified in the local Bay Area. I wonder if you would comment on the impact of climate change and the opportunities that are there, or some of the challenges that might be there.
Terrific. Derek,
I can start, yeah. I mean,
good.
So I have 2 kids, and I think about this. Carl, nice to see you. You know, for what their future means. And so from a jobs perspective, as we think about a just transition from a fossil fuel economy, I think one of our greatest challenges and opportunities is going to be how we think about that middle wage job growth and recreating a Bay Area economy that is not based on fossil fuels and is a new reality, a new business model. And that is absolutely at the core of what we've got to do.
Good job.
So this is something that we think about a lot in Marin, and recently, just a couple Saturdays ago, we brought together the Marin City community as well as some community members from the canal to have a conversation about sea level rise, because we're all going to be affected by it. I think one of the opportunities as we look at climate change is to think about how we frame the discussion. Historically, climate change and preservation of the environment was really geared around that conservation and preservation of the environment. That gets certain people very interested in it, but if you start to frame it in a public health frame, and you look at the fact that if the sea starts to rise, it's going to have an impact on me and my family, you get more people to the table having the conversation. And then, you know, towards the tail end of our meeting, the discussion really shifted to, so not only how do we become resilient against climate change, but how do we help and aid to slow it down? So how do we reduce our carbon footprint? How do we make sure that, you know, when we pull up to the grocery store, we cut our car off, opposed to sitting with the car on? I know it's been hot lately, so we want to keep the air flowing. But that's a standard practice for a lot of folks. I'm guilty of it at times, but it presented an opportunity when we put it in that frame of, you know, this can really impact you and your family. It gave us an opportunity to then start talking about how do we change behavior in a way that it achieves a goal that we want. So I think framing has a big deal to do with you know, how we get more communities involved with this discussion.
Great.
I think that's one of those, just to add really quickly, I think that's one of those things where the impacts of climate change and environmental injustice are so disparate. I'm just coming from that screening this afternoon of Romeo is Bleeding, where you see the Chevron refinery exploding and you know, the folks that are affected by that. But the solutions benefit everyone. Kind of like what Ratna was saying, let's build bike lanes for everyone. So I think this is one of those areas where, like, everybody, if you have kids, if you have families, if you breathe, you get it, you know? And I think that's where it's like, let's head for that future where the solutions are gonna benefit all of us.
Well, it's interesting here in the state because we actually have a sustainable communities program in the state, right? And we have targets, and we're starting to think about the connection between housing and transit and jobs as part of a climate change, right, push as well. Ratna, I'm sure you're familiar with this. I'm going to give you a moment.
Right. I mean, we've made it climate change part of our public policy at all levels of government in California and nationally a bit. And we talk about it, but we are not doing a lot of the things that we know will work. And we're being polite and deferential to local interests a lot of the time to do that. And you know, on the part of greenhouse gases that come from transportation, if we would build housing near our jobs, if we'd make walkable communities, if we're willing to make people pay for their impacts a little bit more, we could actually start to make a dent. We know these things, but we are still a little bit slow to take action on them. I don't know, like, how many of you in this room are really ready to pay for parking every single place you go. That's a really tough one, or pay to use a highway, but that's what it's gonna take to actually be much more aggressive about reducing our risk of climate change.
So I want to give each of you a chance to help us wrap here, and I want to ask you to give us a sense of what you're most optimistic about, where you see that possibility for a collective Bay Area equity agenda, and where you would want everyone here to be thinking about working together in an effort to really make it collective, to have this incredible array of people thinking about that future. Who wants to start? I can choose. Okay, Derica.
Okay, here I go.
Go for it.
All right.
Then we'll just go down from there.
Yeah, I'm actually really optimistic. Otherwise, I don't know how I would go to work every day. What am I most? So the level and scale of organizing, the resources that are going into organizing and building power are not enough. But people are focused and get, well, they're not. I mean, but,
Agreed.
like, I feel like people are getting that their approach needs to have more than I've seen. So I'm very optimistic about that. I feel like the labor movement in the Bay Area is doing an incredible job of resourcing organizing for the first time in a long time. You've probably read about the shuttle bus drivers doing organizing recently. I mean, so that's has me really optimistic. I think if to go back to something I said earlier, I really do want to see that organizing lead to taking back democracy. And so, you know, whether that's a school board, Matt, that leads to something else, right? Or you know, a board or a commission, I feel like every one of us has a role to play in thinking about how the politicians is no longer a dirty word because it's us. So that's something I want to leave people with.
Yeah, and I don't want you to think I'm pandering, but this particular conference and San Francisco Foundation's direction, Fred, to say that this is something that we're gonna own and that we're gonna not only talk about in our circles of friends, but we're gonna talk about to the broader community, I think is huge. Foundations by definition, and community foundations, you know, it's groups of rich people giving money to be given away. And oftentimes, it's been my experience, they direct how they give based off of the feedback that they receive from the conduit, so the foundation. For those rich folks that are gonna be donating through San Francisco Foundation and the Marin Community Foundation, for them to understand equity, and equity in the way that they give and how it's impacting communities, the policies and the practices that many of them engage in. I think it starts an honest dialogue. And I'm very optimistic that if this approach continues, that we'll have strategies for dealing with equity coming out of the private sector. I would love to see an equity index be just as important in a political campaign as the NASDAQ or S&P 500. Because when that message is out there and when folks are held accountable for equity being achieved, then I think it will actually happen. But we have to incentivize it, and we have to make it sexy, we have to make it cool, and we do that by talking about it in the right circles.
Say I'm optimistic about a lot of things after hearing folks up here and what they're working on. It's really incredible. I'd say I'm optimistic about something that I think few people would ever say they're optimistic about, and not something that we talked a lot about up here. But I'm optimistic that we can end mass incarceration in America. And hopefully that we can start in the Bay Area and that we can start in California. I think it's something that has had such devastating impacts, human, moral, financial, on communities, especially communities of color, that it's hard to get to all of these other issues when that eyesore is still there, and that's continuing to pull away and break up families and destroy communities. And so I think that in this moment that we're in, when there's this wide recognition, I think across political party, across region, everything, that this system has been a terrible failure, and that we need to go in an entirely different direction, I think is hopeful in a lot of ways, because not only can we get rid of incarceration, but we can also think of opportunity differently. We can think of redemption and who deserves to have a chance in our society, who we're giving up on, and whether we give up on anybody. I think as long as we have millions of people funneled into cages, it's hard to think about a new idea of what equity looks like, either in the Bay Area or California. So I'm hopeful that we will end mass incarceration in America and start in the Bay Area.
Excellent.
Definitely a big hope and a noble one. And yeah, I think I'm like Derica. I mean, couldn't do this work if you know, we weren't the kind of people who thought a different world is possible. And I think just what I'm optimistic about is, you know, I think as everybody's been saying, people are just getting it and getting it in a way that's not about systems and just getting really basics, like you should be able to live where you work and work where you live. And so should your children, and so should your parents, and so should your friends. It's so simple. It's like Professor Pastor was saying earlier today, we just want to make beauty with our friends. We live in a region of incredible beauty and abundance. And I think that's why we all love it so much here, despite the inequities and the challenges that we see every day. And I think more and more people are just saying it's not okay that some of us have easy access to that beauty and abundance and some of us don't. And the power building that you're seeing in the spaces that are not within the traditional halls of power, not even within traditional 501c3 nonprofit organizations like my own, which I think is awesome, but you're seeing a community-rooted movement that is then connecting up with government, which still has a huge role to play, with nonprofits and philanthropy, which still have a huge role to play, but is happening on its own organically through social media, through streets and schools, wherever. I just think people are getting it, and you know, I'm excited to see where it leads.
Great.
Well, I'll point out something a little different about why I'm optimistic, which is that we can divide and conquer a little bit. It takes a lot of expertise and relationships to make any progress on any of these things, dealing with institutions and knowing their whole history and how they got to where they are. And so I know that I can and will call everybody up here and say, what's the deal with this place? And what do you need to do to cut mass incarceration in half, Matt? Explain it to me really quickly so that I can then, I'm sure it's easy. Yeah. So then I can tell these other people who I get to be with. So there's a way that we can socialize information and solutions that I think is astounding. And then therefore I can work on transportation, but I can also work on that in the course of my day. And I think that's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it has been this incredible conversation of connections and of the possibility of making more of those connections. I was thinking as you all were talking about the reference earlier this morning, the story of David and Goliath, and how now we look back and we say, well, David actually won because he was smarter, he was strategic, and he was practiced. And it does feel to me in this conversation, both this conversation and one we've been having today and the one that the San Francisco Foundation is deep into having around equity, that it is about being smart and strategic and using what we have and making these connections and being able to make the pitch in a way that we can each see what we can do in an agenda that really is part of our broader agenda and maybe not our specific expertise, but we can contribute and help make that change. So I just want to say to everyone here that we hope you will stay in this conversation with us, that we hope you will both be in the conversation and then be in the work to really advance equity, to advance greater racial and economic inclusion in this region that we all love, and that we all want to see be a place where everyone can participate and prosper. So please join me in thanking the panel.
Great job.